philosophy and spirituality, knowing, not knowing. Our discussion today is focused on epistemology. Epistemology is an important area in philosophy, focused on the problem of knowing, the problem of knowledge. In spirituality, especially in Hindu spirituality, knowing is important, but even more important is not knowing. This not knowing is not a state before knowing, rather it is a state after knowing. So there are three states: the state of ignorance, the state of knowledge, and the state of enlightenment, which is again a state of not knowing. So this not knowing is beyond knowing, not prior to knowing. One of the core problems in modern philosophy, which is intensely focused on epistemology, is this problem of knowing. And this problem came to the center with Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant proposed the process of knowing, which was there is a stimulus, our senses interact with that stimulus, and we have a sensation. Sensations from different senses are coordinated into a perception. It is then thought over in a context to result in a conception, and then we use prior knowledge, intuition, all sorts of processing techniques to come at knowledge. And such knowledge over a long period of time can help us to get into a state of wisdom. But the process of knowing essentially was stimulus, sensation, perception, conception, knowledge. This was the core process of knowing put out by Immanuel Kant. And this led to a question: is this the only process of knowing possible to human beings, or are there other ways through which we can know something? So what was this problem of knowing? How many different ways exist that human beings can come to know of something? Is the Kantian process the only process through which we can know something, or are there other ways of knowing? This question raises the possibility and the question again of how does the East and West look at this problem of knowing? Because the problem of knowing is central not only to the epistemology of the West, especially in the era of modern philosophy, but this has taken center stage in Hindu philosophy also in ancient times. So the problem of knowing has been extensively deliberated upon, contemplated upon in Hindu philosophy also. Hindu spirituality also has a lot to say on this process of knowing, because spirituality takes you into rare states. Mysticism and spirituality both take you into rare states, which are not states experienced by everyone. These are rare states which either by accident or by a long preparation, one is able to experience. And in these states, it is said a different kind of knowing happens. And this expands the canvas of the ways of knowing. Spirituality also tells us about the state of enlightenment where there are no thoughts. There is high awareness and bliss, but no thoughts in the normal sense of the term. And this state of not knowing is put up as the goal state, ideal state, beyond the state of knowing. To the extent that in one of the Upanishads it is said, he who does not know is unfortunate. He who knows is even more unfortunate. In the sense, he who knows has a big baggage to shed and his ego won't allow it, so that it's even more difficult for a knowledgeable person to get to the state of enlightenment than for a simple person to get into the state of enlightenment. Obviously, there are many qualifications, caveats to this simple aphorism. However, it does help us to lay out the context of our discussion of knowing and not knowing. So the title tells us as a gnome, it has multiple meanings if you unpack. First is, it is about knowing and it is about not knowing, meaning it is about knowing and ignorance. Second, it is about knowing, not knowing, which is to know enlightenment. Third, it is about two things, knowing as well as not knowing. And fourth, it is about the hierarchy of not knowing, knowing, and again not knowing. The paradoxical path of development where the two ends are the ends of not knowing, but the end of not knowing post knowing is very different from not knowing prior to knowing. You can't compare the two, they're very different. The only difference between these two states, the two end states, pre and post knowing, are that the traditional process of knowing is at rest. Otherwise, there is no other commonality between these two states. One is the alpha, the second is the omega. So with this background, let us get into today's discussion in the broad area of philosophy and spirituality, focused on epistemology as we see in modern philosophy and on Hindu spirituality, with a clear focus on one topic of knowing and not knowing. Let us reflect upon the problem of knowledge and knowability. The problem of knowledge is very clear that as a species, we have the capability to generate knowledge and we have an infinite desire for infinite knowledge. We have a desire for infinite knowledge, perfect knowledge, eternal knowledge, absolute knowledge. And as we start on our journey of knowledge, one of the questions that comes up is, what is the process through which we know? Knowledge about knowledge, knowledge about the process of knowing. And the second question is there a limit of human knowledge beyond which it cannot go? Is there a possibility of knowable? Is there a limit of boundary of knowability beyond which is the unknowable? So we have the unknown, the known, the can be known, and the unknowable. So we move from a process of not knowing anything to knowing something, to that which as yet we don't know, but we know in future we will know it. And the unknowable, which at no point of time the human species will be able to know it. And on this limit of knowability, there has been quite some work in modern philosophy, also in ancient Hindu spirituality and Hindu philosophy. So let us start with Descartes. And before Descartes also, one of the definitions given to man was he was a thinking animal. And Descartes coined it in a more popular way, in a more resonating way, to say, I think, therefore I am. And this gave rise to quite some amount of positivism. And there was a movement after Descartes in certain parts of the world where certain groups of philosophers were hopeful of infinite progress and solving all the problems based upon reason and knowledge. And they thought there was no limit of knowability. There was nothing like an unknowable. All you had was the known and the unknown. There was nothing like an unknowable. Hume brought in a very important aspect of the eternal certitude and reliability of even what is knowable, the qualitative aspect of knowable. And when Kant took it up, something important came out. He drew the limits of knowability. So he postulated a process of stimulus, sensation, perception, conception, and knowledge. And there was no way of knowing except to pass through this process. And we cannot overlive this process to know anything. We can't dispense with any of the constituent phases of the process of knowing to know anything. And this created two limitations. One, the limitations of our sensory apparatus, and second, the limitations of our thinking apparatus. And our knowledge was confined to the limits of what was allowed by the limits of these two constituent apparatus of thinking. And therefore, the thing in itself was not knowable completely. And this set a very strict limit to knowability. And if you put a question as to who would not have this limit, the Kantian limit of not knowing the thing in itself with certitude, to use a phrase given by, I don't recollect the name, but the person was a professor in Oxford. He said, if you conceive of a being to whom the Kantian limits don't apply, he has to be God. Less than that, the limits of knowability would apply. And this created, and it still creates, a dissonance in those who intuitively feel that what Kant proved seems unassailable, but intuitively you feel there has to be something else to it. It cannot be all of it. And Schopenhauer tried to expand this limit of knowability by saying that apart from the Kantian process of knowing, we directly know what is inside of us. So the inner knowing is slightly different from the outer knowing. One way to look at this journey of knowing or knowability, both, is to see a continuously contracting contingency and a continuously conceding of ground by human mind to the unknowable. So we see the first limit. So first we see the positive omnipotence, some years following Descartes. Then we see the qualitative limitation of there not being eternal certitude and reliability of what is known by Hume. And then we have a very strict limits put by Kant. So from trying to know reality to trying to accept, reconcile with knowledge without eternal certitude and reliability, to further contraction in our hopes of positive omnipotence in terms of not being able to know the thing in itself. And therefore, what we can know is the contingency that we are able to experience. So from reality to the contingency that we can experience, and then even further contraction of this contingency, where linguistic philosophers, especially Wittgenstein, they tried to plot the limits of knowability by bringing into question the limit of language. Some would say the limit of language and Kant's limits are the same, but most would say the limits of language even are more contracted limits than the Kantian limits are. So it is a further contraction of contingency. And as we see this contraction of contingency, this conceding of the battlefield to the unknowable in the history of philosophy, we see two different counterpoints to this movement. And the two counterpoints to this movement, you can see one in the West from Hegel and second in the East from Hindu spirituality. In Hegel, we see the resolution of Kant's problem of alienation, purpose, and the foundation for categorical imperative, resolved through the subject and the object both being linked together as being parts of an unfolding spirit, the absolute. And once the subject and the object were related, were both expressions of the spirit and both were participants in the unfolding of the spirit in the historical process. Hegel did not postulate a different process of knowing that was different from Kant, but he did open up possibilities for parapsychological and mystical knowing in his conceptualization of there being an organic unity at some metaphysical level and also possibly therefore at the physical level, and there being a design in history. So Hegel could not actually, he did not much give emphasis on the finding a way out of the difficulty put up by Kant. but he did create a framework in the context of which mystical and parapsychological knowledge, process of knowing, could be located and could be explained in metaphysical, if not physical terms. And then we have Hindu spirituality, where there again is a concept of the unknowable, a limit to knowability, but it is different from Kant's limit of knowability. So Hindu spirituality does expand the canvas of ways through which something can be known, modes of knowing, and at the same time it expands the limits of knowability. Let's go into details and then I'll take up this 9th point again. So with this background of East and West on knowing, not knowing, and knowability, let us go into the epistemological process of different types of knowing. So Immanuel Kant said there was only one way to know, which was the way of sensation, stimulus, sensation, perception, conception, and knowledge. And then when it comes to the eternity of knowledge, he also refers to the mathematical knowing. So at best, liberally speaking, we can grant him two ways he has accepted of knowing. And the third way would be the way of knowing about morality, which would be intuitive knowing. So that is partly we can grant him that certain parts of this he also referred to. But it was very difficult for him to accept or to make central any other way of knowing other than the classical way that he was referring. So let us look at various types of knowing. One knowing is the conventional knowing, the empirical knowing using the senses, the Kantian process of knowing. The second is tautological knowing, where we say a bicycle has two wheels, which is eternally true because we define bicycle first as a vehicle having two wheels. So the predicate is already there in the subject. It's a tautological knowing. Then there is a mathematical knowing, where you can deduce something from something known. And that also gives you knowledge. So there's a third way of mathematical knowing. There's a verbal and deductive knowing. That the deductive process, you don't have to always do it mathematically. Verbally also you can do deductive process, and from one known you go to the other known. There is intuitive knowing, which Kant uses while discussing morality but does not call it as a distinct method of knowing. That you know by intuition. Right? Hindu spirituality is very liberal and very extensive on this way of knowing. And this is this by discipline one can develop. It's not something only miraculous. Knowing by revelation, the type of knowing that is referred to in Hindu classics, where the mantras are revealed or certain things are revealed. For example, revelations of mystics, of religious authorities, a very different kind of knowing. one can easily confuse the intuitive knowing and revelatory knowing. But if you go into nuances of it, there are different ways of knowing. There is a knowing by identity, and Sri Aurobindo and Mother and many forms of Indian philosophy and spirituality also refer to this. And this is a process very different from the Kantian process. The idea here is that the consciousness of the subject identifies with the consciousness of the object, and in that identity, the consciousness of the object reveals its knowledge to the probing consciousness. It is knowledge by identity. In psychotherapy process, we see this often when the patient is able to tell something very deep and secret about the therapist, and the therapist knows it is right. It is a knowledge by identity, and at times it can also be knowledge supplied unconsciously by projective identification by the therapist, but there can also be a knowledge by identity. So this also brings up one more element of knowledge supplied unconsciously by one to another. That's also a way of knowing. There is a parapsychological knowing which is extrasensory, and the whole area of parapsychology which goes into precognition, retrocognition, remote viewing. It opens up completely new areas of non-sensory knowing, non-Kantian knowing. So there is also a parapsychological knowing. How in terms of process this happens, we don't know. But there are more than convincing examples, adequate examples of all these forms of knowing. Ninth form of knowing is spiritual knowing. When one develops adequately spiritually, new knowledge dawns, or what was known starts converting itself into a realization and brings about lasting changes. There can be knowing because of something being given, not in a sensory ordinary way, but in a deep inward way. A mystical giving by X to Y. It contains the unconscious transfer, as I said. If one believes in higher spirits, it can also come from. There is a grace knowing by grace. That because of grace of the Guru or higher beings, there is some particular way of knowing. Kind of knowing which would elude one if one does not have that grace. There is a transformative knowing, where what is known suddenly becomes effectual and transformation happens. Or one just hears something and a transformative knowing happens inside. So there would be a stimulus of the Kantian type from outside, but what happens inside is radically different. It's a transformative knowing. There can be a reincarnational knowing if you believe in reincarnation. And Ian Stevenson's work has many cases of knowing because of experiences of past lives. It is very near to Jung's idea of knowing by being in touch with the collective unconscious, which is a transpersonal concept. So this is also in a way a transpersonal concept. And we also know now by looking at experiments on the mice that there is intergenerational transmission of trauma. So there is also an intergenerational genetic transmission and knowing from there. Then there is mystical knowing because of undergoing certain mystical processes, certain things are known, which otherwise are not possible to. And there is traumatic knowing because of a trauma, what we deal in psychotherapy. Because of a trauma, certain templates are created, certain knowing happens, and that doesn't go away easily. It troubles the person for a long time. So apart from the Kantian classical process to know, there are many other ways of knowing. I have listed out 15 of them. There can be many more. Coming to not knowing. Not knowing as a starting point of ignorance is very different from the spiritual not knowing we are referring to. The spiritual not knowing happens after a long process of knowing, when one almost gets tired of knowing and one is done with acquisition of knowledge. So in the spiritual process of self-development, at some point, there is a cessation of the quest for knowing. And one gets into a state of enlightenment, which is a state of not knowing. Some spiritual schools also talk about the same state being as a state of all knowing, and all knowing in an essential sense, not in a comprehensive sense. And in the state of enlightenment, there is rest in knowledge and bliss of silence. So this is a very distinct state of not knowing, which actually is kept as a goal state above the state of knowing. Another approach to the concept of not knowing is the Lacanian concept of the real. That part of the mind which is unprocessable in language, which eludes being known by definition. So in one sense, as Zizek says, the real of Laka is almost like a formal category. It is by definition that which cannot be known. So whatever is known is no longer in the real, because by definition, real is that which has not yet come in the realm of language. It can also be a large part of the real can also be pre-linguistic experiences which even retrospectively could not be translated in terms of language. It can also be very difficult trauma which eludes the grasp of language. Another take on not knowing the unknowable is the application of the concept of unknowable to the capacity of the knowing apparatus to know itself. So there are two applications of the unknowable. One, unknowable out there, the thing in itself. And second, the unknowable of the knowing apparatus in its own exercise of self-reflection. How far can it go? Can it know itself completely? Or is there an unknowable there also when the knowing apparatus tries to know itself? Can the process of knowing reflect upon the most fundamental elements that constitute and operate in the process of knowing? Or if it is not an assembly of elementals, if it is one fundamental consciousness, then how far can it know itself? And therefore, the concept of unintelligible does not only apply to the thing in itself, but also to the knowing apparatus and its journey, its quest to know itself, to apply itself to itself. Yet another way of looking at the concept of the unknowable is to plot, as Wittgenstein says, the limits of language. So then, once you plot the limits of language, inside the language you have the sense and the nonsense. And then you have boundary over which you have to pass over in silence. Wittgenstein would pass over in silence even in the area of nonsense. So his ladder would be starting from the sense and going beyond the boundary. Many people would put the ladder in the outer boundary of the nonsense and then move to beyond the boundary of the knowable. Depends on where you put Wittgenstein's ladder. Hindu spirituality tells us that the self journey is such that there is a undeniable minimum motivational movement towards experience, contribution, evolution, and therefore one has to move from not knowing to knowing in order to participate and experience this movement. So from not knowing to multi-source knowing, the knowing in life. So this is the state of ignorance, not knowing. Then participating in life according to the self journey and karmic load. And there is multi-source knowing in ordinary life. And then if self-development has been adequate, one enters the state of enlightenment, not knowing. And then one has a really free choice of being in a state of not knowing or being in a state of knowing as one chooses or as necessity compels. Before the state of enlightenment, there is no choice. One is just thrown forcefully from the state of not knowing to the state of multi-source knowing. It's only after the state of enlightenment of not knowing that one has a choice of being in the state of knowing or being in the state of not knowing. And this journey of ordinary life of multi-source knowing, spirituality helps us to accelerate it and quickly finish the phase of knowing to move to a greater state of not knowing, and thereafter even a greater state of choice of knowing or not knowing. Let us just quickly go through the rare states of not knowing. The states of not knowing we are referring to are not the states of mental retardation, not the states of drowsiness, not the state of unconsciousness or coma, but we are referring to full-blooded, fully aware states of an individual, and yet they are states of not knowing. It is a myth that in the waking state, you cannot have cessation of thoughts, that thoughts will stop only when you die. It's nothing like that. It's only that these states are rare states, not ordinary states experienced by everyone every day. So let us reflect quickly on those rare states. There are parapsychological states of not knowing. Those who practice parapsychology realize this, that often in their journeys, they frequent the states of not knowing. So there are parapsychological states of not knowing, experienced rarely by common individuals, very frequently by those who regularly are into the parapsychological game. There are mystical states of not knowing, of those who are into deep mysticism, because obviously it is a esoteric science about which we know little, and therefore it's more like a craft, the craft of esoteric science. Then we have the state of spiritual enlightenment, and these states also are states of not knowing. And as I have said before in other presentations, enlightenment is not one state but a category word for a collection of states, a variety of states, different states. And it can be confusing because These states are very distinct states. Only common thing between all of them is there is no ordinary process of thinking. Otherwise, on other parameters, the states that are listed here are very different, and all of them are called states of enlightenment. In fact, we should be using more precise language of E1, E2, E3, E4, and E5 for a more precise communication. But somehow human beings are not very precise in their language. They are hesitant to coin new words or new notations and are more comfortable in the confused state of one word representing many meanings. And we can't live without a dictionary, where in fact we should be living without a dictionary. There should be no need for a dictionary, where the circularity is in vogue. Even if there are dictionaries, we should have non-circular dictionaries, only because we can't remember everything, not because X is defined in terms of Y, Y in terms of Z, and Z again in terms of X. So this circularity of language, this use of category words in language, that needs to be removed by a more precise and a more elaborate language with more words and more notations. Anyway, given what it is, the state of pure awareness is one state where there is not knowing in ordinary sense, but yet there is pure awareness of everything, but no ordinary thought process of the Kantian type. There is a second state where there is awareness, bliss, and emptiness. There is a third state of all negating absolute, the nirvana. There is a fourth state of awareness, bliss, and involvement. And the involvement may get into a state of knowing, but it may also be in the state of not knowing. Let me just remove this part, be confusing. And there is a state of, so we look at pure awareness, awareness, bliss, awareness, bliss, emptiness, nirvana, stillness. All these states involve the phase of the concept of not knowing. And the journey, as we said, is from, you have to put one more phase here. From not knowing from not knowing from the state of not knowing to the state of knowing to the state of enlightenment, and then choice between knowing and not knowing. This is how the epistemological journey happens across one's journey of self-development. Thank you.